Hello and welcome to Nap to History, a quiet space where we slow down and let the past unfold one soft story at a time. Tonight, we'll gently wander through one of the most devastating chapters in medieval history, exploring the lives of those who faced the plague, not to dwell on darkness, but to understand the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. Whether you're lying down for the night or just taking a moment to breathe, I'm really glad you're here. If you find comfort in calm, thoughtful history, feel free to subscribe. There's always another peaceful chapter waiting. Before we begin this journey back in time, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share if you enjoy calm historical storytelling like this. Let's take a moment to set the stage. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was marked by many challenges, but perhaps none more devastating than the recurring waves of plague that swept across Europe and beyond. The most infamous of these outbreaks, known as the Black Death, arrived in Europe in 1347 and would claim the lives of an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the continent's population over the following years. But this was not an isolated event. Plague had visited European shores before and would return again, each outbreak bringing with it a unique set of horrors and human stories that reveal both the fragility and the remarkable endurance of medieval life. Our journey begins in the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean, where the seeds of catastrophe first took root in the autumn of 1347. Picture the harbour of Messina in Sicily, where Genoese trading galleys limped into port after their long journey from the Black Sea region. The ships that should have brought prosperity and exotic goods instead carried death itself. Sailors lay dying or dead at their oars, their bodies covered in painful black swellings called buboes, their skin darkened by hemorrhaging beneath the surface. The horrified port authorities tried to turn these ships away, but it was already too late. The plague had arrived in Europe, and from these ports it would spread like wildfire across the continent. The disease that medieval people called the Great Mortality, or the Great Pestilence, was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though this scientific understanding lay centuries in the future. Medieval physicians and scholars could only observe its devastating effects and struggle to comprehend what they were witnessing. The plague manifested in 3 primary forms, each bringing its own particular horrors. The bubonic form, the most common, caused painful swellings in the lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes could grow to the size of apples, turning black as they filled with infected blood and pus. Victims experienced excruciating pain as these swellings pressed against nerves and surrounding tissue. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood-tinged sputum that spread the disease through respiratory droplets. This form was particularly terrifying because it spread rapidly from person to person and killed with frightening speed, often within 2 to 3 days of the first symptoms appearing. The septicemic form, perhaps the most dreaded of all, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims of this form experienced internal bleeding that darkened their skin, leading to the ominous name Black Death. These unfortunate souls often died within hours, sometimes before the characteristic buboes even had time to develop. Imagine the terror of ordinary medieval people as they watched their world transform before their eyes. In the morning, a neighbor might appear perfectly healthy, going about their daily tasks of tending livestock, working in the fields, or managing their household. By evening, that same person could be writhing in agony, burning with fever, and covered in the telltale signs of the plague. Families faced impossible choices as the disease ravaged their communities. Should they care for their sick relatives, knowing that such care might mean their own death? Should they flee, abandoning everything they had ever known in the desperate hope of outrunning the invisible enemy? The progression of the disease was merciless in its consistency. It typically began with what seemed like common ailments, a sudden fever, chills, and weakness that might initially be mistaken for any number of lesser illnesses. But soon, more ominous symptoms would appear. Victims experienced severe headaches that felt as though their skulls were being crushed from within. Their bodies ached with a deep, bone-deep pain that made even the simplest movements agony. As the fever mounted, many became delirious, crying out in languages that made no sense or seeing visions of demons and angels that existed only in their fevered minds. For those suffering from the bubonic form, the appearance of the buboes marked a turning point. These swellings would emerge seemingly overnight, growing rapidly and causing pain so intense that many victims could not bear to be touched. The skin around these buboes would turn dark purple or black, and they would often burst, releasing a foul-smelling mixture of blood and pus. Medieval physicians, working with their limited understanding of anatomy and disease, attempted various treatments that often caused more suffering than relief. They would lance the buboes with knives, believing that draining the infected matter would help the body heal. They applied burning poultices made from exotic spices, thinking that intense heat might drive out the disease. Some physicians even resorted to bloodletting, weakening patients who were already fighting for their lives. The psychological torment that accompanied the physical suffering was perhaps equally devastating. Medieval people lived in a world where disease was often understood as divine punishment for sin, and the arrival of such a comprehensive catastrophe led many to believe that the end times had arrived. Imagine the weight of this belief on the minds of the afflicted as they lay dying, convinced not only that they were being punished for their transgressions, but that the entire world was ending around them. Some plague victims spent their final days in agonized prayer, desperately seeking forgiveness for sins both real and imagined. Others fell into despair so complete that they abandoned all hope of salvation, living their final hours in a state of spiritual darkness that their medieval worldview suggested might damn them for eternity. The speed with which the plague could transform a thriving community into a charnel house was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. In healthy times, medieval villages and towns operated according to well-established rhythms. Farmers tended their fields, craftsmen worked at their trades, merchants conducted their business, and the church bells marked the passing hours with familiar reliability. But when the plague arrived, these comforting patterns disintegrated within days or weeks. Fields went unharvested as entire families succumbed to the disease. Workshops fell silent as master craftsmen and their apprentices died in rapid succession. Markets closed when there were too few people left alive to buy or sell goods. The breakdown of normal social order created additional horrors for those who managed to survive the disease's initial assault. With so many dead, there were often insufficient living people to properly bury the bodies that accumulated with terrifying speed. In many communities, the careful funeral rites that had provided comfort and meaning for generations became impossible to maintain. Bodies were hastily thrown into mass graves, sometimes without the blessing of clergy who had themselves fallen victim to the disease. In some cases, entire families died so quickly that their bodies lay undiscovered for days or weeks, adding the horror of decomposition to neighborhoods already struggling with the omnipresent stench of death. Children, always vulnerable to disease, faced particular terrors during plague outbreaks. Many found themselves orphaned overnight, their parents taken by a disease they could not understand. These surviving children often wandered through empty streets, searching for food and shelter in a world where the adults who might have cared for them had vanished. Some were taken in by surviving relatives or neighbors, but many faced starvation or fell victim to the disease themselves before help could arrive. The lucky few who survived to adulthood often carried psychological scars from witnessing such devastation at such a young age, their view of the world forever shaped by the knowledge of how quickly security and love could disappear. Women during plague times faced unique challenges and horrors. Pregnant women who contracted the disease often lost their unborn children, if they survived at all. Those who were nursing mothers faced the agonizing choice of whether to continue feeding their infants, knowing that they might be passing the disease to their most precious loved ones. Many women found themselves suddenly responsible for managing households and businesses when their husbands died, but they had to do so while grieving, and often while fighting the disease themselves. Widows who survived faced an uncertain future in a world where so many traditional support systems had collapsed. The medical profession, such as it existed in medieval times, was utterly overwhelmed by the scope and severity of the plague. Physicians trained in the classical traditions of Galen and other ancient authorities found their carefully studied theories useless against this devastating disease. Many doctors fled the cities when the plague arrived, abandoning their patients to save themselves. Those who remained often did so at the cost of their own lives, as they had no understanding of how the disease spread and took few precautions to protect themselves. The failure of learned medicine to provide any effective treatment led many people to turn to increasingly desperate measures. Folk remedies proliferated as communities searched for anything that might offer hope against the plague. People burned aromatic herbs and spices, believing that pleasant smells might drive away the miasma or bad air that they thought caused the disease. They wore amulets and charms, drank concoctions made from exotic ingredients, and subjected themselves to brutal treatments based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Some believed that the disease could be cured by inducing excessive sweating, leading victims to bundle themselves in layers of clothing and furs even as fever already raged through their bodies. Others thought that consuming certain foods or avoiding others might provide protection, leading to dietary restrictions that often left people malnourished and more vulnerable to disease. The economic devastation that accompanied plague outbreaks created additional suffering for survivors. With so many workers dead, the labor shortages that resulted led to the collapse of many economic activities. Farms could not be maintained, trade routes were disrupted, and the careful systems of production and distribution that supported medieval life began to break down. For those who survived the disease, the world they returned to was often economically ruined, with empty houses, abandoned businesses, and collapsed markets, creating a landscape of desolation that matched the human devastation. Currency itself became problematic during plague outbreaks, as people became reluctant to handle coins that might have passed through the hands of plague victims. Some communities resorted to barter systems, while others simply saw their economic life grind to a halt. The wealthy sometimes found that their gold and silver could not buy them the necessities of life, when there was simply no one left alive to provide services or produce goods. This economic collapse meant that even those who escaped the disease directly often faced starvation, exposure, or other dangers that could prove equally fatal. Religious life during plague outbreaks was marked by both increased devotion and profound crisis of faith. Many people turned to prayer and religious observance with desperate intensity, hoping that sufficient piety might protect them from the disease or secure their salvation if they died. Churches that remained open often overflowed with terrified congregants seeking divine intervention, but the church itself was not immune to the plague's devastation. Priests, monks, and nuns died in proportions equal to or greater than the general population, in part because their duties required them to visit the sick and dying. Entire monasteries were sometimes wiped out, taking with them not only individual lives, but also centuries of accumulated learning and spiritual tradition. The loss of clergy created spiritual crises for communities already struggling with physical and economic devastation. Without priests to perform last rites, hear confessions, or conduct funeral services, many people faced the terrifying prospect of dying without the spiritual comfort that their faith traditionally provided. Some communities appointed lay people to perform simplified versions of religious rites, while others simply had to abandon religious observances entirely. The failure of prayer and religious devotion to protect communities from the plague led some people to question fundamental assumptions about divine justice and protection, while others interpreted the catastrophe as proof that the end times had arrived. Food production and distribution systems collapsed under the weight of plague mortality, creating famine conditions that compounded the disease's direct effects. With so many farmers dead, fields went unplanted or unharvested, leading to severe food shortages. The complex networks of trade that brought food from agricultural areas to cities and towns broke down when key participants died or fled. Even when food was available, distribution systems often failed because there were insufficient living people to transport goods or maintain markets. Survivors often found themselves facing starvation, even if they had successfully avoided the disease. The combination of plague and famine created a vicious cycle as malnourished people became more vulnerable to disease, while disease-weakened populations were less able to maintain food production. Some communities attempted to address these problems by organizing collective efforts to harvest crops or distribute available food, but such cooperation required social trust and organizational capacity that were often among the plague's casualties. The psychological trauma experienced by plague survivors was profound and long-lasting. Those who lived through major outbreaks often described feeling as though they were living in a world transformed beyond recognition. The familiar rhythms of life had been shattered, trusted institutions had failed, and the basic assumption that life would continue in recognizable patterns had been destroyed. Many survivors reported persistent nightmares, anxiety, and a sense of living under constant threat even years after plague outbreaks had ended. Children who survived plague outbreaks often exhibited behaviors that we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. They might refuse to be separated from surviving family members, have difficulty sleeping, or show extreme fearfulness in situations that reminded them of their traumatic experiences. Adults, too, struggled with the psychological aftermath of witnessing mass death and social collapse. Some became obsessively religious, while others abandoned faith entirely. Some became reckless, living as though each day might be their last, while others became paralyzed by fear and reluctant to engage with the world around them. Personal hygiene during plague outbreaks often deteriorated dramatically, both because of the breakdown of normal social systems and because of misunderstandings about how the disease spread. Many people became reluctant to bathe, believing that water might carry the disease, or that opening the pores of the skin might make them more vulnerable to infection. The accumulation of dirt and waste in plague-stricken communities created additional health hazards and contributed to the spread of other diseases that could prove fatal to people already weakened by plague exposure or survival. Housing conditions deteriorated as plague outbreaks progressed, creating additional health risks for survivors. Houses where plague victims had died were often abandoned, sometimes with bodies still inside, leading to contamination and pest problems that could facilitate the spread of disease. Overcrowding occurred in surviving households as orphaned children and other displaced people moved in with relatives or neighbors. Poor sanitation and inadequate waste disposal in these crowded conditions created breeding grounds for the fleas and rats that helped spread the plague bacterium. The clothing of plague victims posed particular challenges for survivors. Garments worn by those who died of plague were contaminated with infected fleas and bodily fluids. But in a world where clothing was expensive and difficult to replace, survivors often had little choice but to make use of these items. The practice of stripping clothes from plague corpses for reuse almost certainly contributed to the disease's spread, but poverty and necessity often overcame fear and caution. Travel during plague outbreaks became extremely dangerous, not only because of the risk of exposure to disease, but also because of the breakdown of hospitality and assistance networks that normally supported medieval travelers. Inns and taverns closed, either because their proprietors had died or because they refused to accept travelers who might carry disease. Communities that had traditionally welcomed pilgrims and merchants began turning away all outsiders, sometimes with violence. This meant that people caught away from home when plague struck often found themselves stranded in hostile territory with no means of support. The care of plague victims fell primarily to family members, who faced agonizing decisions about how much risk they were willing to accept in order to provide comfort to their loved ones. Some families barricaded themselves in their homes with sick relatives, sharing their fate whether that meant recovery or death. Others abandoned plague victims, sometimes even their own children or spouses, in desperate attempts to save themselves. The moral weight of these decisions haunted survivors for years, as they struggled with guilt about those they had abandoned and grief for those they had lost. Medical understanding of the plague was so limited that many treatments actually increased rather than decreased suffering. Physicians prescribed bleeding, purging, and other procedures that weakened patients who were already fighting for their lives. They administered medicines made from toxic substances like mercury and antimony, believing that strong poisons might drive out the disease. Some treatments involved burning the skin with hot irons or caustic substances, adding external injuries to the internal devastation already caused by the plague. The isolation of plague victims was practiced in some communities, but often in ways that created additional suffering. Sick people were sometimes locked in their homes, and left to die alone, with food and water left outside their doors if they were fortunate. Entire families might be sealed into houses where one member had shown signs of plague, condemning healthy individuals to almost certain death. These quarantine measures were often ineffective because medieval people did not understand the role of fleas and rats in spreading the disease, but they added the horror of abandonment and isolation to the physical suffering of the disease itself. Communication during plague outbreaks broke down almost entirely in many regions. With so many people dead or incapacitated, the networks of messengers, merchants, and travelers who normally carried news from place to place ceased to function. This meant that communities often had no warning that plague was approaching, and no knowledge of how other areas were coping with the crisis. The isolation and uncertainty this created added to the psychological trauma of plague outbreaks, as people had no way of knowing whether their suffering was unique or part of a broader catastrophe. The documentation of plague experiences was sporadic and often incomplete, as many of the educated people who might have recorded events became victims themselves. Some chronicles and letters survive that provide glimpses into the daily experience of plague victims, but these accounts are often fragmentary and focused on the most dramatic events rather than the ordinary details of suffering and survival. This means that much of what plague victims experienced has been lost to history, leaving us to imagine the full scope of their ordeal based on incomplete evidence. Recovery from plague, for those fortunate enough to survive, was often a long and difficult process. The disease left many survivors weakened for months or years, vulnerable to other illnesses, and unable to resume their normal activities. Some developed lasting complications from the buboes, including scarring, limited mobility, or chronic pain. Others suffered from what we might now recognize as depression or anxiety disorders, struggling to rebuild their lives in a world that had been fundamentally changed by the catastrophe they had witnessed. As we've seen, the life of a medieval plague victim was marked by unimaginable physical suffering, psychological trauma, and social abandonment. From the first appearance of fever and weakness through the development of agonizing buboes to the final struggle for breath, the progression of plague was relentless in its cruelty. Yet even in these darkest moments, we find evidence of human resilience, compassion, and dignity. Some families remained together through the worst of the disease, caring for each other until the end. Some communities organized collective responses to help orphaned children and isolated elderly people. Some individuals dedicated themselves to caring for plague victims even at the cost of their own lives. The plague victims of medieval Europe faced horrors that challenge our imagination, but their experiences also remind us of the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. They lived through a catastrophe that seemed to mark the end of their world, yet many survived to rebuild communities, preserve knowledge, and continue the human story. Their suffering was real and terrible, but it was not meaningless if it helps us understand both the fragility of human life and the remarkable resilience that allows us to endure even the worst that history can offer. These stories of medieval plague victims invite us to reflect on our own mortality and the precious nature of the healthy, peaceful moments we often take for granted. They remind us of the importance of community, compassion, and mutual support during times of crisis. And they offer a sobering perspective on the challenges that humans have always faced, helping us appreciate how far medical knowledge and public health practices have advanced, while acknowledging that the fundamental human experiences of fear, suffering, and hope remain constant across the centuries. As we come to the end of our exploration of this difficult chapter in medieval history, we might do well to remember that the plague victims we've discussed were not abstract historical figures, but real people with names, families, dreams, and fears, much like our own. Their experiences of suffering and survival are part of the larger human story, reminding us of both our vulnerability and our capacity for endurance in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The remarkable resilience shown by plague survivors, who went on to rebuild their communities and lives, offers hope and inspiration even today. These medieval people faced a catastrophe that killed millions and destroyed the familiar patterns of life. Yet many found ways to continue, to care for others, and to preserve what was valuable from their past, while building something new for the future. Their example reminds us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit has an extraordinary capacity for renewal and hope. We hope you found meaning in this difficult but important journey through one of history's most challenging periods. Though the subject matter has been somber, perhaps there's comfort in knowing that humans have always found ways to endure, to care for one another, and to rebuild after even the most devastating losses. The medieval plague victims we've remembered tonight faced unimaginable hardships, but their legacy lives on in the communities, institutions, and knowledge that survivors work to preserve and rebuild. As you drift off to sleep, may you find peace in the safety and medical knowledge that protect us today, and may you carry with you the inspiring example of those who found ways to hope and help others, even in humanity's darkest hours. Until next time, sweet dreams of a world where human resilience and compassion light the way through even the deepest darkness.